Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at an extremely rare version of the SKS. This is a Bosnian modified Yugoslav M59 66. Now, it's currently in a configuration that's basically identical to the standard Yugoslav pattern, and that's because these were rebuilt this way before they were imported into the United States. They came into the country with all of the other Yugoslav M59 66s that came in. There were a ton of those coming in 10 or 20 years ago. And just a tiny number of them were these Bosnian modified ones. So what did they modify? Well, Bosnian armorers converted these to be fully automatic and to feed from modified AK magazines, which is kind of a necessity. If you're making it full auto with a fixed 10-round magazine, that kind of, what's the point? But once you add quick detach 30-round magazines, it might be a vaguely viable weapon. Now, these were done obviously during the Yugoslav civil wars. There was a tremendous amount of sort of ad hoc firearms stuff that was going on. We've previously looked at a whole bunch of different domestic manufactured Croatian submachine guns that came out of this same overall conflict. So it shouldn't be surprising that this sort of thing was being done in other states of the former Yugoslavia, like Bosnia. So, to me, the full auto thing is, okay, that's fine, but we don't have any evidence of it because we don't have any of the full auto parts in these guns. That's why they were able to be legally imported. We'll talk about that in detail at the end of the video. To me, the more interesting question is, what did they do to adapt these rifles to AK magazines? Because that seems like it could be a very practical modification for a whole lot of SKSs, full auto or not. So let's take a closer look at what was involved in making that change. So the only visible changes to these guns on the outside are on the stock. We've got this big plate here, a cutout here, and we actually have an additional pair of holes in the receiver, or in the stock here. Now, this is your selector plate. So I can't show you any of the trigger component conversion elements because I don't have those. I just have a semi-auto standard factory trigger here. But the selector lever went in right here. They make a cutout in the stock to accommodate the selector lever. It's going to have a mechanical effect on the trigger mechanism inside. And then there's a selector plate. So you had two selector settings. R is full auto and J is semi. So that allows you to actually switch the gun back and forth. It was a true select fire conversion, not the sort of ad hoc thing that, you know, it's converted to full auto only and you pull the trigger once and it just dumps the entire magazine, anything like that. Now, these two holes, I suspect, were used to secure plugs to fill up essentially the front portion of the stock here, because these were converted to use AK mags, which are only about that long. In fact, we'll use this AK mag as an example. That's about how big they are, so you're really going to want to fill in the front end of the stock there. But they had to get rid of those pieces to put the regular magazine back in when these were imported into the US. Now, these disassemble exactly like standard SKSs, so I'm going to skip that part and just show you the internals. So here's our Bosnian conversion. This is a generic and fairly dirty and grungy Chinese SKS. So if we look at the receiver here, it's never been refinished, so it's conveniently nice and shiny, and you can see the machining operations that were done to open up the magazine well. The reason for that is the original SKS magazine here is nice and narrow, and it fits right into that magazine well. That's obviously what it was designed for. AK magazines are rather thicker out here, and they don't fit. So the Bosnians milled out that so that they do fit. Drops right in there. Easy peasy, right? So that's the first modification. Now, there was a little more that was necessary to do to actually make magazines fit, because the nose, the front tab of this magazine, doesn't quite fit in there. It's a little too small or too large to fit in under this locking tab in the front. And of course, the rear tab in the back is like that, doesn't work. So what the Bosnians did is they actually modified magazines to have a much longer tab, much lower down, that would lock in using the same magazine catch that was already standard on the SKS. So unfortunately, I don't have a magazine to show you, but I do have photographs of one here, and so you can see what that would have looked like, how that tab fits under here. The geometry is changed so it will actually fit. So these converted rifles did not use standard AK magazines. They had to use modified AK magazines, which is also probably part of why they were so scarce. There is one other modification that had to be made here, and that was to narrow the bolt. So this is our Bosnian bolt. This is our regular, in this case Chinese, but standard bolt. And you can see that this section right here has been narrowed down. And the reason for that is the geometry of the feed lips on the AK versus the SKS. The SKS feed lips are actually a bit wider than on the AK. So on the SKS, the bolt is going to ride right like that. And that's how it pushes a cartridge out of the magazine into the chamber. Well, if we're going to try and do that on an AK mag, that SKS bolt only goes that far and it gets stuck. You can see it's narrow at the front there just to make sure everything lines up and it can properly, reliably feed. But on the AK mag, it just don't fit. So the Bosnians narrowed the whole length of that bolt, well, all the way back, as far as it needs to go to be fully in battery, so that the Bosnian bolt will, in fact, slide all the way through the magazine, like that. So there you go. There are your modification elements. We've got the slot for the selector switch, the selector plate. By the way, this example, the selector plate was removed before it came into the US. That's pretty common. It's actually even rarer to find them with the plate intact. Most of the ones that came in are like this. And then we've got our holes up here in the stock. You can see just barely that hole goes through. So they had a screw coming through this side that doesn't actually poke out. One coming through that side that didn't actually poke out to hold presumably a block of wood in there to fill in the magazine space. Then you've got your magazine well opened up and your bolt narrowed down. So not pictured the full auto fire control group, which never came into the country, and I don't have an example to show you. Of course, the other reason that we're able to see these in the United States now is that none of these modifications actually cause any problems or are a problem when rebuilding the rifle into standard semi-automatic. So none of these were changes that would have prohibited or prevented you from putting the gun back together as a standard SKS, just like that. Unfortunately, I have almost no information about the details of when this was done, exactly where it was done, how many were done, that sort of thing. We know they're very, very scarce. Even over in the Balkans today, they're extremely scarce guns. I would estimate there's probably about a dozen of them in the United States, and the magazines are actually scarcer than the guns because when they came in, they were in this configuration with regular SKS magazines. There are a couple of magazines in the country. Saw pictures of one. Unfortunately, I was unable to borrow one to put into one of these rifles to show you the complete package. Perhaps at some point we'll actually find an intact one in the Balkans. But unfortunately, the other thing that we need to talk about here is the legality, because I know if I don't bring it up, it will dominate the conversation in the comments. There is an ATF policy of once a machine gun, always a machine gun. People are going to bring that up. Like, these are all illegal machine guns, right? The answer is no, they are not. And that's because these were all made by the factory, the Kragujevac factory, as semi-automatic SKSs. There were never any factory-made full-auto SKSs. Maybe a few prototypes in Russia at one point, but none of the factory production was actually full auto. So this is a semi-automatic rifle. The receiver modifications are entirely based around changing the magazine to an AK magazine. The receiver was not modified in any way for it to be full auto. Instead, the modifications for full auto were all done to the trigger pack and the stock. As a result, legally, this falls into the same sort of category as if you have a registered transferable drop-in auto sear for an AR or an HK, it fits into a semi-auto receiver, the gun becomes full auto. The receiver does not legally, in the United States, become a machine gun. You can take your drop-in auto sear, take it out of whatever AR receiver you had it in, and that receiver reverts or never changed from being semi-automatic. That's the case here. The most common comparison I suspect people will make will be to M1 and M2 carbines, which are similar in that the receivers are identical. There's no receiver modification to make an M1 carbine full auto into an M2 carbine. However, the ones that are legally considered machine guns are the ones that are marked M2. So that's the difference there. If you took a registered conversion kit for an M2 carbine and you put it onto a semi-auto M1 carbine, you could then take it back off and you would have your registered conversion kit along with your still legally semi-automatic M1 carbine. So I don't believe any of these trigger packs have actually shown up and been registered in the US, but there are people who have converted SKS trigger packs to full auto and registered them before the 1986 prohibition on that sort of thing. So there are full auto SKSs out there. For what it's worth, one of the things that experience tells us about these guns is they were probably very high rate of fire. We're probably talking about 1,000 rounds a minute. And this isn't a gun that was designed to be fully automatic. So I suspect part of the reason that not many of them were made is they probably don't work that well. They're probably beat themselves up. It's not, you know, if you want a full auto 7.62x39 and you're in the Balkans in the early 1990s, get yourself a Zastava M70. Like, there's problem solved. So as a result, these are very scarce, which makes them extremely cool today. So I would like to give a really big thanks to the folks who were involved in loaning me Bosnian SKSs for today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.